Hi, so today we're going to be looking at doing one of your transmission assessments. This particular one is the clutch removal and inspection. I've got the actual gearbox and engine on a separate stand, so clearly this is slightly unrealistic, but you are only expected to remove the gearbox, inspect and replace the clutch. I will be taking you on a quick tour of the engine bay in a moment, just so you can see the kind of work required to actually get to the point where you can access the gearbox. So, removing the gearbox from the engine requires a significant amount of work. The first thing would be to remove the battery safely and actually remove it from the vehicle to allow access to the gearbox mounting, which is typically underneath the battery tray when the battery is in the location you can see, which of course is the near side front area of the engine bay. That will allow you also to have access down into some of the controls. You can just see highlighted there the clutch cable, which would need to be removed, and just to the side of that is also the gear selection cables as well. Various electrical connections would need to be removed as well. You can see one just down there, which is our TDC sensor, as well as the starter motor. You may also need to remove the airbox as well, just to give you access to the bell housing bolts which hold the gearbox onto the engine. We're under the vehicle now, so you can see some of the things that need to be removed prior to getting the gearbox out of the vehicle. Currently you can see the drive shaft, leaving the gearbox here on the left, going into the hub. There's the lower suspension arm and the strut assembly as well. So clearly that's all got to be removed, and then you can ease the drive shaft out from the gearbox. Just up through the gap in the light is the starter motor. That would need to be removed, and coming down here you can see the other drive shaft that follows across to the off side of the vehicle, and you can see coming out into the hub. So the same again on this side. Drive shaft would need to be removed, strut assembly and hub as well. This particular car is quite accessible. You can see the subframe here, which kind of wraps around the gearbox and quite nicely does kind of follow the shape of the gearbox, which means you don't necessarily have to remove or loosen the subframe in order to remove the gearbox. There is plenty of room around this particular design to get that gearbox off the engine and back out from underneath the vehicle. As I said, this particular gearbox will come out from underneath. Some boxes will come out on top. Here you can see in the centre of the picture the square drive drain bolt key for the gearbox. It's good best practice to empty the gearbox of oil because once the drive shafts are removed, as you can see in the top of the corner of the picture there, you will have an oil leak and it gets quite messy. So it's a good idea just to drain the gearbox oil. So consequently, once the gearbox has been refitted, you would then need to replenish the oil, and here is the filler level plug. So the procedure would be to continue filling oil into the gearbox until it overflowed out of that hole. As previously stated, you would need to remove the gearbox mounting. You can just see the bracket that will go up to the chassis to hold the gearbox in place in this particular view. But of course it does mean that the engine now is not secured in the engine bay. In order to secure the engine and prevent it from falling out and perhaps damaging itself, you would use some kind of support beam. I'm currently showing you an engine support bar that sits across both inner wings. You would then attach the hook that's in the middle to an appropriate lift-in eye on the engine. If I just zoom in, hopefully you can see there is the lift-in eye. So that would hook into the actual hook on the beam, and that would then take the weight of the engine so that you can then remove the gearbox mount. This is dependent upon the material that the manufacturers use for the car. If these front wings are made of plastic or aluminium, which is the trend nowadays, there isn't the strength in the wings to support the engine weight. Therefore, you would need to use some kind of support bar from underneath the car. Most manufacturers, if that's the case, would have produced a specific frame that mounts to the underside of the car and supports the engine from underneath. So this is a good opportunity to show you some other equipment that you may be needing to use on this job. I've already shown you the engine support beam. You've seen the transmission jack in previous videos. So that's that tall jack with a claw, and the idea of that is that the gearbox sits in that claw and you can remove the gearbox out from the car using that if it's coming out from underneath. If the gearbox is coming out from on top, then it's quite awkward to actually manhandle that gearbox when you're bending over the vehicle. So you may well have to use something like this. I'm going to use this morning anyway, just to help me with the gearbox that you saw at the beginning. I just wanted to show you how this is set up and how to use this. So this is something new, engine crane that you haven't seen before. So in order to unfold the crane, we'll simply just release the legs. You can see I've got one down already. The legs are held in place by a safety pin. Just control the legs, they are quite heavy, so just bring them down. Once they're in place, refit the pin, and the pin itself has a safety clip. This particular one is an R clip, and that goes back into the pin, and that locks it into place. The crane is ready for use. Just like any other hydraulic system, check that there's no leaks on the ram. Hydraulic ram is in the middle here, and we've also got the safe working load for the crane. Depending on the length of the arm, it does weaken its capacity, I suppose, but even on the weakest setting of 250 kilograms, that's still plenty of load left just to lift the gearbox out, either out of the car or just off the engine on the stand. To use it, we've got our operating bar. We've got a little tap at the bottom here that just locks off, and then it just pumps away. And as you can see, the arm is then raised. One point to be aware of: if you do need to extend this arm, don't pull the pin and let the arm come out when it's angled down, because this will just come flying out of the tube, and if you're anywhere near it, it'll smash into your legs. So don't adjust the length of this arm until the arm is at least horizontal. Here you can see the third piece of equipment that you may need to use on this particular job. Again, depending on where the gearbox is going to be coming out from the car, either the crane if you're going to use it out from the top, or in most cases it comes out from underneath, and you'd be using a transmission jack like the one here. This particular one is for a manual box. There are specific shaped tops for automatic gearboxes because they are a lot heavier and they need to be bolted into place. But as you can see, this would simply just sit underneath the gearbox and be ready to catch the gearbox or locate onto the gearbox as it comes down. It just takes the weight and makes life a little bit easier for you. So now we're back, ready to remove the gearbox. All the previous work that we've just gone around the car and explained to you would have been done. So we're now at the point where the gearbox can be released from the engine. It's a simple matter of removing the bell housing bolts around the edge of the gearbox and then simply sliding that gearbox off the back of the engine, and that will expose the clutch, and then we'll carry out the inspection of the area and remove and replace the clutch. So what I've done here, I've removed most of the bolts from the bell housing. I've laid them out in the sequence that they kind of fit. So this is the lower half of the bell housing. The single bolt on its own is from the very top of the bell housing up near the rocker cover of the engine. I've also laid them out in the direction that they go. So these ones go into the gearbox and the top one goes into the engine. It's also important to get the length, as you can see, because there are different lengths of bolts as well, and they need to go back into the right hole. So it's quite important that you lay the bolts out so you know exactly which bolt goes into which hole and in which direction. As I've just shown you, I've removed all the bolts with the exception of one at the top. I've also brought the crane into place and have put the chain into the hole where the clutch cable would go, and that's a convenient place to actually lift the gearbox off. Even with just one bolt in place, the box won't fall out. It's held in place, or it's sitting in place on two dowels, which I'll show you in a moment when the box is off, and that single bolt just holds it and locates it into one place. It's quite a good process, quite a good practice to do. Just leave that one bolt and you can then get the rest of the stuff out of the way. Okay, so I'm here now. I've just got that last bolt to take out. I'm not too worried about the weight of the box. The crane's got the weight of the box. You can see the box now is kind of loose to move. I'm just going to take the last bolt out and put it in with the rething and in the direction that it goes. So stand that one up like that, and then I can just wiggle this box off the engine. Because the engine is at a slight angle and the box at the moment wants to come out horizontally, I might just have to lower the crane down a little bit. So I'm just going to release that tension on the chain just a smidgen, and that's just going to drop it down. You can see now it's a bit freer, and that's now just going to hopefully just come straight off like that. Okay, and I can wheel the gearbox out of the way, and that reveals the clutch assembly. I've now lowered the gearbox onto the floor because you never work on a suspended load, you always put it down on the floor. You can also see right in the centre of the picture the gearbox input shaft, and sitting on that is the clutch release bearing. When you change a clutch assembly, you will always have a new release bearing, and that's something that you'd need to change. I mentioned a moment ago about the dowels. There's one dowel there which precisely locates the gearbox and prevents any kind of misalignment with the bolt holes, and this is the clutch assembly here. So the blue bolts will need to be removed. There's 6 of them, and they're also again locating dowels for the clutch assembly as well. So they just simply need to be removed equally and evenly, just releasing the tension, and we can then release the clutch. Quite often the problem you have when you go to undo the bolts on the actual flywheel that's holding the pressure plate in place is that when you go to turn them, they actually turn the whole engine. So consequently we need to lock the flywheel into place so that we can actually remove these bolts. You can purchase specific tools that lock into the teeth of the flywheel. Alternatively, on the other end of the crankshaft there is a pulley for all the drive belts, and that pulley is held in place with a large nut of some sort or bolt. You can then put a spanner onto that bolt, hold the crankshaft whilst you then remove and loosen these bolts. I'm just doing that at the moment, so I'm just holding that crankshaft while I spin out these bolts. I've now removed all but the last bolt. What I don't want to happen is the clutch plate to drop out of the clutch, because if it's going to be reused for whatever reason, which you don't typically do, but it may have just been replaced and you've now got another issue, so you're having to kind of reuse the clutch. You don't want to drop it or damage it. So with one hand, just take the last bolt out whilst holding the bottom of the clutch. The clutch shouldn't drop because the actual pressure plate shouldn't drop because it's on the dowels, but the friction plate inside might fall out. And there it is, all off. So there's the pressure plate with the diaphragm spring, and there is the clutch friction drive plate. There are several names for this component. At this stage you should always inspect your flywheel for any signs of obvious damage. The sorts of things that you're looking for are cracks emanating from the mounting bolts, any kind of discoloration, bluing, which indicates overheating. If you've had a slipping clutch for some time, then you would have damaged the surface of this flywheel. Making sure it's nice and dry, no oil contamination, and also looking around the back of the engine behind the flywheel where the main oil crank seal is, and if it's leaking at that point, it's just a quick matter of 6 bolts removed, change the seal, flywheel back on. If you leave it and it continues to leak, it could contaminate the new clutch, and then you've got to do this whole job again just for a 5-minute seal replacement. So it's always best practice, if you're down to this kind of stage, to replace anything that potentially could fail in the future. Ideally you've probably done 100,000 miles at this point, so that seal could well be on its last legs. So it would be recommended to your customer for an additional small charge to replace that seal. The other thing you want to check for is distortion, to see whether the flywheel is warped. So I've set up the DTI, and I'm just going to do a quick run out check to see what the surface is like on the flywheel. If it is distorted, then that will give you all sorts of problems with clutch disengagement and selecting gears, especially forward, the first forward gear and reverse. It will give you all sorts of problems because the clutch won't properly disengage. So you can see the DTI has now been zeroed. I'm just going to simply rotate the flywheel a complete revolution and just check that what sort of reading we have. So we'll just follow that through. As you can see quite nicely, we're not really moving very much. It's hardly moving. In fact, I don't think it's moved at all, maybe 1/100th of a millimetre, so 0.01. Way up to 0.02 there. And clearly I've done a complete spin now. Never mount the DTI on the stand or anything like that. Keep it attached to the engine so that it's all in one position. If you attach it to the stand and the engine kind of moves whilst you're doing it, you're going to get a false reading. Prior to fitting the new friction plate to the actual flywheel, just check that it does actually slide over the input shaft and it's a good fit on there. Also, sometimes you will need some kind of lubrication on these splines. Now, depending on the manufacturing of the clutch, it will either be supplied with its own special grease, which you must use, or the actual teeth inside here, the splines, have a specific coating on them, which means you fit this dry, so therefore it doesn't need any kind of lubrication because it comes through pre-lubricated. If nothing is supplied, then it's good practice just to put a little bit of copper grease on those splines. Doesn't need very much at all, just a little kind of stroke, and just use the actual center plate to spread that grease along the splines. Now we need to prep the actual release bearing. So again, I would just put a little bit of grease on the inside of the release bearing because that needs to be able to slide backwards and forwards as you operate the clutch. It's going to line that up with the actual release fork and drop that into place. So that's now ready to go, and you can just test the operation that when you move the actual release fork, you can see the release bearing is being moved. Once the release bearing has been fitted and hooked over the release fork, if it's a manual type of release bearing, not the more common hydraulic version that we have now, it's good idea just to kind of lock it into place. It's very easy to grab that release fork when you're manhandling the gearbox, and that will cause the release bearing to drop off and sit inside the bell housing. Happened to me once, and I learnt my lesson. So I always now lock that release fork into place with a cable tie. Once the gearbox is located onto the clutch, just before obviously I bolt it up, I just snip that cable tie and release the fork. The next crucial part of the job is to line the clutch up. There's a couple of options that you've got to do this. The first one is this kind of kit here, which you have to kind of select the right bits, and I'll show you where they go and what they do in a moment. Or you have this kind of universal type, which we can use. And the importance of this is the fact that the center spigot here, the input shaft, must locate in the middle of this. And once this is bolted onto the flywheel, if it's not ready to receive the gearbox, it just won't fit back together again. So it's crucial that you kind of pre-line or line up this center part of the clutch ready to receive the gearbox when you rebuild. So the first bit I want to show you is this part here, which comes from the kit. We've got a detachable end and a central kind of section. You've got to choose the two sizes from the kit that fit your job. The first part is to make sure that you've got the end right, and that fits into the center of the flywheel, and that holds that and that locates it centrally. The other important thing to work out is the slidey part fits into the central part of the clutch, like this. And it's just a simple matter of putting it back together on the flywheel, and then that will locate and hold that clutch plate centrally whilst you then fit the cover and pressure plate onto the flywheel. When the new clutch arrives, something to be aware of is that typically this will be protected with some kind of anti-rust film, typically an oil-based substance. So that needs to be cleaned off with some kind of cleaner, otherwise we'll have problems producing friction. Also inspect that the actual friction plate is in good condition. It's not been dropped, it's not buckled or twisted across through there. There's no obvious signs on the edge where it's been dropped on something by the courier. Check the springs are in good condition, they're not damaged, and they're all there and they exist. Next thing is to think about then is how it goes onto the actual car. You'll notice that if you look at the actual friction plate, this side is pretty much level and smooth, whereas this side has got a kind of a ridge. So it's got its central kind of hub area here, which has got a shoulder. Now that shoulder fits inside this space here. So that will turn around and fit into there. Usually to help you, just in case you can't remember which way around it goes, or potentially the clutch might not have an obvious hub, and you're maybe not sure which way to fit it. The manufacturer will supply you with a little guide. So here you can see just here FW and the word side. So that stands for flywheel side. Sometimes it's called engine side. You might actually have the whole word flywheel, but in this case it's just got FW and side. So you know that this surface here needs to go onto the actual flywheel. Now I'm going to run through the operation of this universal clutch liner. It is pretty much one size fits all. However, you can change this cone on the end and have a different piece that fits over here, so you can actually use it for larger friction plates. So it's in two pieces, the clutch at the moment. We have to kind of pre-assemble it, and then we can fit the aligner and check finally that the two pieces are in the right place. So I've got the clutch ready to go. There's the raised hub, so that's the gearbox side of the clutch, and that's going to sit inside this aperture of the clutch cover. And as you can see now, that fits over quite nicely. We're good to go, and you can see the actual splines of the friction plate through the centre of the diaphragm spring. First thing is then to fit this end into the friction plate. You can see it kind of how it works. It's got split ends, and as you pull the cone back it spreads, and that will then grip the friction plate. So I'm just going to put that in, drop it in, just use a flat surface. It's nice and easy to work on. I'm just going to hold the body and spin down this section here. Don't need to go mad, just enough to grip it, and just to be sure it does, if you pick up the clutch cover, the friction plate should come with it. So you now know that that's attached. Okay, drop it back down again, and just by eye to start with, just hold the smaller nut and spin down the larger one onto the fingers of the diaphragm clutch. Again, it's just pinched. We don't need to graunch this up, just to hold it into place. Now that's good to go, and that's kind of now holding the whole thing together. Okay, what we do now is we turn this over, and we're now looking around the edge. What we want to look for is to make sure that the friction plate is totally centralized on the actual pressure plate. So just take your time. If you haven't tightened it up too much, you can move it around with your thumbs, and you can just rotate the clutch and just make sure that, again, it's by eye, but you know, you can be pretty good with your eye. Just check that we've got an equal amount of pressure plate visible all the way around. Okay, so just take your time, just nudge this into place, just looking all the way around, and I think we're pretty much there. I've got a bit of pressure plate shown all the way around. Okay, so now I'm good to go. That's now ready to go back onto the engine. Okay, so I've moved across to Autodata. Just want to check my torque figures. So here you can see I've got the flywheel. So if I had removed the flywheel for a new oil seal, that's how much the bolts would be done up to, 70 Newton meters. The clutch pressure plate is, however, relatively loose, I suppose you could call it, 24 to 35 Newton meters. Not particularly tight. They are only 6mm bolts, so that's plenty enough pressure to keep that clutch located. So I've checked my flywheel, I've got my clutch prepped, I've also cleaned off my flywheel, make sure that it's perfectly dry, ready to go. I've got my 3 aligning dowels clutch is all set up, ready to go. Just final check. I always like to give it just one more final check, just to make sure nothing's kind of nudged or moved, and then we are good to go. So that just sits over the locating dowels, like that. Takes the weight for you pretty much. Get your first bolt kind of started, just by hand. Just spin that up. Just let it pinch. It's not going to do any, not going to drop or anything like that. That just gives you the 2 hands free now to spin the rest of the bolts in. Again, just finger tight to start with. Spinning them all up. Get them into the correct position. They are all the same bolts. Same length, unlike the bell housing bolts, so we don't have to worry about that so much. And now it's just a question of evenly and equally building up the pressure and tightening them up. So I just go diagonally across the clutch. You'll notice as that gets a bit tighter that the pressure on the cover will start to clamp the friction plate in place, which will then free up, and yeah, as you can see that's now already loose. So hopefully now that's trapped our friction plate into place on our flywheel. So I've just evenly and equally just pinch these up, just twist the wrist, that's all you need, and just when that stops, I'm not going to put any force on them just yet, and we're good to go. That's now totally loose. We just back this off and that now releases. And I've got the torque wrench set up at the predetermined figure which we looked at before on Autodata. I'm just going to go around and now to torque them up. Again, just equally across the surface of the clutch. And there's the first one, second. As you saw, the flywheel did move, but it's typically, because it's such a small torque, you don't necessarily need to hold it doing it up, unlike when you undid it. And just finish them off, again, going all the way around. So once you think you've done them all, just go back and double check, count them. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So we're just about to lift the gearbox on now. On this particular engine design, it's got this kind of plate, this adapter plate, which provides the location for the starter motor. This needs to be sat on the 2 dowels. Can get a little bit tricky and fiddly. Often that drops off and becomes a bit annoying, but you've got to make sure that's in the right place, otherwise you won't get the bolts back into the engine. So I've got the gearbox suspended just by the clutch. I thought about the angles I need to recreate. I think there's enough slack in the chain to do that. I've got a bolt ready to go, so the moment the gearbox kind of drops into place, I can then attach it with this bolt and keep it sort of nice and accessible. Hopefully it doesn't drop as I'm wiggling the gearbox. Let's have a go. Just making sure that plate is in position. Just going to try and give it a bit of a line up, and we're on. So I'm going to put my first bolt into that hole, and now as you can see that's not going to go anywhere and the weight's off the chain. I've now fitted all the bolts, but as you can see they are still very loose, finger tight, but the gearbox is quite secure. It's not going to fall off, but obviously it now needs to be finished off. What I want to do now is just cut this cable tie whilst I've still got room to get it out. And that will just slide out of there nicely now, and just check that clutch is working and it's not jammed or anything, it's free to move. Just a question now of tightening up these last few bolts and replace as previously explained. Everything back in the car, good to go. So that's it, the clutch assessment now complete. Gearbox back onto the engine, clutch fitted, flywheel tested, checked for leaks, any additional work explained about oil seals and everything else like that. As I said, it's now just a question, if this was for real, of rebuilding everything else around the gearbox, drive shafts back in, replenishing the oil, battery, gearbox mounts, gear control levers, clutch cable or the hydraulic system, and then a road test to make sure everything worked fine.